what I found very interesting regarding your biography is that you're a researcher at the Zurich University, and you wrote, I think now 5 books on improv theater, and you're also an improv player. And many improv players like to be on stage and to perform, but they're not willing to write it down and also give the knowledge to others, or even investigate in scientific studies. So that is great that you have both of that and combine that. So could you shortly introduce yourself? What is your research area, and what is the topics of your books?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. Happy to join in, especially since some of my idols have been in this talk. Yeah, I started as I started theater. I've done theater work all my life, but I started as a psychologist. Actually, I'm a trained psychologist, and I used to work as a psychotherapist along with playing theater, and did improvisational theater now for over 20 years. And then there were several points where it grew over my head, where I started to think improvisational theater is stupid, it's nonsense, it doesn't produce anything new, and it's kind of a loop that always repeats itself. And this is when I wrote my books. So the first time this happened was in the beginning of the 2000s. And then I wrote the book Theater Without Intention, Theater ohne Absicht, just to clarify my thinking. Actually, was always the intention behind my writing. And then I realized there's a couple of people reacting to that, so that was fruitful somehow. And later I realized, okay, it's getting very specialized, and I wanted to know more about the history of improvisational theater, which is much richer than most of us know. So I started to do another research, which led into a PhD project. So I have a PhD in theater studies now. And lucky me, I found a job as a theater researcher. By the way, it's not the Zurich University, it's the Zurich University of the Arts. So it's an art school. Yeah, that's pretty much my biography.
Now, when I asked you, what would be the title of our conversation? You sent me the title, Being a Cocoon. What do you mean by that?
Yeah, this is a concept that only came to my mind last more applied improv. And I mean by this that the focus is slowly shifting in my mind. Actually, people have been there before, like people like Keith Johnston and Viola Spolin have already done this twist, but for me it became more obvious in the last year that in improvisation you're not only producing, but you're also becoming the environment for your fellow player. And this is the concept, this is the frame of accepting, of listening, and agreeing to what your partner says and making your partner look good, is that you try to become a good environment for the other one. So it kind of takes away the focus from yourself. Actually, it's the same as in the basic example of you're talking to somebody and you find yourself not listening because you realize that you're planning ahead and you're preparing your own contribution to the dialogue. So whenever you're in this tunnel, I say, of intention and preparation, the attentiveness for the situation gets lost. So you kind of go blind and deaf, and you don't realize what's happening in this moment. And I think this is a very small example, but I think it happens in a very big scale too, that when you're under pressure of producing something, you close your senses and you close your body and you close the communication, the dialogical principle breaks down.
I know what you mean. For example, now I listen to you and at the same time I'm planning what to ask next. And I think this is not only for an interview session, but also if I have an informal conversation with friends. I hear some things and while they're talking, I associate with the other things, and I'm not really in connection with the others. So if this is the case, how could we overcome that? How can we really being aware of the other and stay connected with the other person?
I think it's very much a mindset. There's been a lot of talk about the improvisational mindset also here. And I think this is true. You can change a mindset. So you can take off the focus from yourself to your partner. And this changes the world completely if you do that. If you think of yourself as an environment for the other person and for the idea of the other person, this changes. But actually, I think improvisation is even more than a mindset. It has to do with specific attentiveness and responsiveness and connectedness to the environment. And this is the dialogue partner, but it's also the situation. It's the here and now, the famous here and now. And it involves all your senses, and it involves your body, and it involves the space too. More than a mindset as a cognitive thing. And you can change it by training, I think. Becoming a cocoon or listening or getting open to the situation does not necessarily mean that you let go of your intentions, because I think we're planning ahead all the time. It's impossible to go blank in your head. Maybe some monks in Nepal can do it, but I can't. None of us can. But what we can learn is we can adapt our expectations. Like, I'm saying something and you say something, and this doesn't fit into my concept. So something happens within me. Usually I will go into some kind of negative response if what you say doesn't fit my expectations, because it makes me insecure and it tears down my protection. So I'm trying to not have a break of expectation, or I would say expectation violation is something that is hard to deal with for anybody, any of us, but it's a trainable skill. There has been some evidence in studies that breaking expectations is easier to deal with for improvisers than for normal people. So you can learn it. And this is really a neuropsychological process. If something doesn't meet your expectations, something clicks in your head, and you can learn to not have it click that much. The reaction, you can make the reaction smaller.
On your website, you wrote some things you can only learn through improvisation, and that strikes me. So, is this one of the topics that, from your point of view, you can only learn with improvisation, or with the technique and the methods coming from improvisation?
Yeah, that's a very good point. It's a good connection, because you have to find situations that really surprise you to learn this. So you have to create an environment where this is possible. And what I mean by some things you can only learn through improvisation is it refers to the be spontaneous paradox, actually. There's some things you cannot enforce. Actually, there's quite a lot of things you cannot enforce. Things that have to do with the senses and the attentiveness. And with dreaming. For me, improvisation has a lot to do with public dreaming. And this is something that just happens through letting go. So it's not something you can do consciously. And this is quite a lot. This is what I mean by improvisation teaches you things you can only learn through improvisation. And when it comes to art, I think this is even more evident. There's a quote by by Paul Sills, who says, what we are interested in is material that can only emerge through improvisation. Otherwise, improvisation would only be some kind of preparation or some first stage of an artistic process. But to me, improvisation and improvisational theater really produces something that has a different quality as an artistic product. And you can only achieve this through improvisation. It's impossible to achieve it any other way.
Now that sounds interesting. So I just imagine that we record a theater production with all the after a lot of rehearsals, and then we record an improv theater piece, and then we have two artworks. Now, what is the difference? Because you said, well, improvisation is something different. What is the difference if you improvise and not rehearse in the first place?
This is a very interesting question, and it's also researchable. You can do experiments like this. Like Yuri in Japan is doing this. She's comparing scripted scenes with improvised scenes, and she's trying to match them as close as possible. And she's comparing how the actors feel, and she's also comparing what the audience sees, if there's any difference. And it's not done yet. It's a PhD. She's been on it for 4 years already. It's taking a long time. But what she told me is that you can the improvised performance is perceived as much more lively, much more authentic, which is probably what you would have suspected, and that it's the small variations of timing that make things that differ. And it's probably when you perform a play from day to day and you have the same script, there's probably small variations of timing too. So this is probably what makes the live aspect. So now I'm talking to you, I see you nodding, I'm kind of adapting to what I'm seeing. Yeah.
So if political communicators more or less say always the same sentence, regardless what the question is, it feels unnatural.
Yeah.
Now, is this what you described? This feeling that it doesn't feel natural because they just say what they remembered, but they do not react on the question?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, they're under pressure. They're afraid. It's a typical situation that Keith Johnston would call they're in stage fright, and they're freezing and they're reproducing all old ideas to protect themselves. Of course, that's what they do. Most politicians do it, except Donald Trump. We had a lively discussion about Donald Trump being a very good improviser because he's just blowing out bullshit whenever he feels like doing it. So, but that's another discussion.
Now, if I would generalize the idea of scripted things versus improvised things, we're now in a situation in which many scripted plans cannot be applied anymore because our life changed, organization had to change. Now, what can we learn from improvisation to deal with these unforeseen situations as human beings, in which we suddenly have to react on a situation that we did not expect in the first place?
Yeah, I think this takes this enforces creativity, obviously, in some people, and in some people it enforces going straight back to the line. So you can see there's different types of people who deal with the situation completely different. And I suppose, and I would suggest that improvisers are more in search of the advantages of the situation. They try to realize what's going on, and they come up with a lot of ideas already. A lot of them are not good, but that's not the point. The point is not to freeze in the eye of the tiger somehow. To stay awake and produce a vast amount of ideas, because there might be a good idea in it. And I think improvisers are very good at taking an idea a little further, because they tend to accept it. They learn to accept an idea, and they build on an idea until it becomes something. Yeah. They don't step on it as a little plant and destroy it in a very early stage, but they let it blossom to a certain point, and then an idea might change its quality. So an idea that seems stupid when it's very small, when you build upon it, it might become a good idea. Strange enough, but I've seen it. And also, it trains us to look at ideas, and this is what I'm calling the environmental thinking. An idea looks stupid in front of a background, of a certain background in a certain situation. And improvisation teaches us to change the background. So we get a line from an improviser, and it looks like a stupid line, but we make this idea look good. So we train an ability to change the environment of the idea instead of changing the idea. So we're not looking for a good idea for this world, but we're looking for a possible world for the idea, which changes everything around.
I like this thought very much, because it changed the whole framework. Mm-hmm. Now, most of the people worldwide would not consider themselves as improvisers. So what can people who would not call themselves improvisers learn from improvisation for their daily life in their organization or with the family?
Well, for daily life, I think the statements of Keith Johnston are still valid. Improvisation teaches you to get into adventures and lead a more risky life somehow. Get off the track, which is still important today, even more than before. We're going into a very machine-like age. It's very much dominated by plants, even more than before. So for the personal life and for the development of the personality, I think improvisation is extremely valuable. And I'm saying this with a background of being a psychotherapist. But there's so much behind it that I'm not going to get into it. Much more difficult for me is the question, how can business people, companies profit from improvisation? How can you make that transfer? This is a kind of something I've been thinking about a lot. I'm convinced that they do profit. And I've been, when you post that question to me, I asked myself, why do I like to work with improvisers? And I like to work with improvisers also in contexts out of improvisational theater. So I'm starting a project, a research project, and there are improvisers involved, and everything is easier. Everything, the whole communication is easier. So I started, what is this? What am I talking about? Why do I prefer improvisers when I'm working together with them? And I think one point is they tend to have short-term interactions, so they don't have monologues, and they don't follow their ideas, and they don't push their ideas through, but they hand over the ball to the other person much earlier. And I think the applied improvisation network even puts this in the center of their approach. It's short-term taking, which changes the dialogue completely. So this is what I like. I like about improvisers that they're immediately, and we can see this in this interview too, they're looking for common ground instead of differences. And this is because they are trained to do this. They get on the stage, and this, I'm of course not in applied improv, but the principles are the same. They get on the stage and they have no preconditions. They have nothing that's set. So they are trained to find something common, which Keith Sawyer calls the interactional frame, and it emerges from nothing. Or Keith Johnston calls it the circle of expectation that comes up, or circle of possibilities, as he later says. So they start with nothing and they build up something. So they have a specific focus on building common ground without preconditions. And this is also important for intercultural communications, for example, because we're not assuming that the other will understand us, but we're checking. And another thing that I think is good for working with improvisers, that they, and also I also already said this, they are able to adapt expectations very easily without being hurt. So you don't have to be so careful when you work with them and you have a relationship and you say, no, this is not a good idea. An improviser will probably not be as much hurt as another person, because for improvisers, ideas are everywhere and you can be very generous with ideas. Keith Johnston said he doesn't, he never pushes through an idea, because if there's resistance, he just lets it go and lets another idea come up, because he knows there's an infinite number of ideas. And ideas are nothing really; they're nothing. Yeah. So improvisers will not fight for an idea as viciously as other people. And I think these things that I just said that make me like to work with improvisers are exactly the same things that will probably make improvisers good team members.